He had survived 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, 2 IED explosions, and a gunshot wound to the shoulder. He had jumped from planes at 30,000 feet, swam through black water with enemies on every side, and never once broken. But nothing. Not war, not hell, not the worst corners of the earth, prepared Kaden Voss for what happened to him inside a courthouse in broad daylight on a Tuesday morning in front of witnesses, cameras, and a judge who looked the other way. What happened next shook an entire nation to its core. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Clarkson County, Georgia. The courthouse on Peyton Avenue smelled like old carpet and bureaucratic indifference. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular soul-draining flicker that made everyone inside look a little more pale, a little more tired than they actually were. The security line snaked around the lobby, a quiet shuffle of people, defendants, witnesses, lawyers with rolling briefcases, family members clutching manila folders like lifelines. Kaden Voss stood near the back of that line, wearing pressed dark slacks, a crisp white button-down shirt, and a simple black tie. He was broad across the shoulders in the way that suggested something more than a gym membership. His jaw was set. His eyes were calm, the kind of calm that doesn't come from comfort. It comes from training, from years of learning, to breathe through situations that would make most human beings simply collapse. Kaden wasn't at the courthouse as a defendant. He was there as a witness, a routine matter, actually. A former neighbor's property dispute had somehow escalated into a civil case, and Kaden had been subpoenaed because he'd observed the disputed fence being installed. He told his attorney, a sharp and perpetually caffeinated woman named Alara Thorne, that the whole thing would take maybe an hour. He had a lunch shift at the Veterans Outreach Center, where he volunteered every Tuesday. He planned to be done and out the door. That plan did not survive contact with Officer Ronan Blaine. Ronan Blaine was a veteran of the Clarkson County Sheriff's Department, and a man who carried his authority the way some men carry a loaded weapon, pointed slightly at everyone around them. He was assigned to courthouse security that morning, a rotation he typically hated because it meant standing still, checking bags, and listening to metal detectors go off. He had a broad, reddish face, the kind that stayed perpetually flushed regardless of temperature, and small eyes that moved quickly, always searching for something to assert themselves against. Blaine had not looked up Kaden Voss's name on the witness list. That would become important later. When Kaden reached the metal detector, he placed his phone, his keys, and his wallet into the gray plastic bin, just as everyone else had done. He stepped through. The detector stayed silent. What happened next would be the subject of 5 separate official reviews, 2 independent investigations, a federal inquiry, and one of the most quietly devastating press conferences in Georgia's recent legal history. Blaine stepped directly into Kaden's path. "Step aside," he said. Kaden looked at him. "Excuse me?" I said, "Step aside. Random secondary check." Blaine's voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has never once been told he was wrong by someone he was required to listen to. Kaden nodded, compliant, patient. He had been trained to de-escalate. He stepped to the side. What followed was not a secondary check. It was a performance. Blaine moved slowly, deliberately, talking over Kaden as he spoke, asking redundant questions, demanding repeated explanations of why he was in the courthouse, asking for ID twice, even after Kaden had already shown it, then asking him to remove his belt, his watch, and his shoes. People in line began to notice. Some shifted uncomfortably. A young black woman near the door made eye contact with Kaden and gave the smallest shake of her head, the universal gesture of, "I see what's happening here, and I'm sorry." Still, Kaden complied. Belt off, watch off, shoes off. Standing in the lobby of a public courthouse in his socks, he remained composed because he understood, as he had been forced to understand his entire adult life, that composure in this moment was not weakness. It was survival. Then Blaine grabbed his arm, not to guide him, not gently. He grabbed Kaden Voss's forearm, twisted it backward, and shoved him hard into the wall to his left. "I said, move over there," Blaine said, loud enough now for the entire lobby to hear. Kaden hit the wall shoulder first, the same shoulder that still carried fragments of a bullet from Helmand Province. He didn't cry out. He turned slowly and looked at Blaine with an expression that would later be described by multiple witnesses as the most controlled they've ever seen a person look in a physically threatening situation. "Officer," Kaden said quietly, "I need you to take your hands off me." Blaine leaned in close. Or what? And those two words were the match that lit everything that followed. Within seconds, the lobby situation had escalated to the point where 2 additional deputies rushed over, and Kaden Voss, United States Navy SEAL, combat veteran, holder of a Bronze Star with combat distinguishing device, was being physically restrained against a courthouse wall while his belt and shoes lay in a gray plastic bin feet away. He was not fighting back. He was not raising his voice. He was standing completely still, both arms now held by 2 deputies who had responded to Blaine's call, while Blaine himself stood in front of him and appeared to be explaining to anyone within earshot that the subject had been acting erratically and refusing to comply. This was a lie. A blatant, brazen, audacious lie. And it would have worked perfectly, the way it had worked perfectly in countless other lobbies, on countless other streets, in countless other small moments that never made the news, if not for 3 things. The first thing was the courthouse security camera positioned directly above the metal detector, running on a high-resolution digital feed that captured every frame of the interaction from start to finish. The second thing was a retired schoolteacher named Lila Cross, who was standing feet away and had been filming on her phone since the moment Blaine stepped into Kaden's path. Lila had lived in Clarkson County her whole life. She knew exactly what she was watching, and her hands were steady. The third thing, the thing that would unravel everything, was the phone call. It happened while Kaden was still against the wall. One of the responding deputies, a younger man named Deputy Harlan Novak, was running Kaden's information through the system in a routine check. Novak was young, on the job, and he had the still intact conscience of someone who hadn't yet learned to look away from uncomfortable things. He was reading Kaden's file on his handheld when his expression changed, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness that came over his face. He walked slowly over to Blaine. "Ronan," he said quietly. "You want to see this?" Blaine didn't look at him. "I'm busy, Harlan." Novak's voice dropped lower. "Seriously, you want to see this right now?" Blaine finally turned, took Novak's handheld, glanced down at the screen. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face. Not remorse, not exactly, but something close to the look a man gets when he realizes he has stepped on something that is about to break loudly beneath his foot. He handed the device back to Novak without a word. He did not release Kaden. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge that the man he had just shoved into a wall was a decorated United States Navy SEAL with 3 combat deployments, a security clearance that required annual federal review, and a service record that included operations Blaine didn't have clearance to know about. He simply stepped back slightly and said stiffly, "You're free to go. Mind your business next time." Kaden Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he bent down, picked up his belt from the bin, his shoes, his watch. He put them back on methodically, one by one. Then he straightened, buttoned his cuff, and walked towards the elevator without another word. It was only when he got upstairs and sat down outside courtroom 7, waiting to be called as a witness, that he took out his phone and made the call. The man who picked up on the third ring was named Tariq Lang. Tariq Lang was a former JAG Corps attorney who had transitioned into private civil rights law after years in the military legal system. He ran a small but exceptionally well-connected firm in Atlanta called Lang & Associates, and he had known Kaden Voss since they'd been stationed briefly at the same base in Virginia. He was the closest thing Kaden had to a legal guardian, a mentor, and an older brother, all compressed into one extremely sharp, extremely patient human being. Kaden kept his voice low, even in the corridor outside courtroom 7. He described what had happened in the lobby in exactly the order it occurred, with the precision and economy of language that his training had made second nature. No embellishment, no emotional coloring, just facts, sequence, and outcome. When he finished, Tariq Lang was quiet. "Are you injured?" he asked. "Shoulders sore, old wound site." "Did you document anything?" "A woman was filming. I didn't get her name. The courthouse has cameras." "Yes." Another pause. When Tariq Lang spoke again, his voice had taken on a quality that people who knew him well recognized immediately. It was the voice he used when he had already seen the path forward and was simply deciding how fast to walk it. "Kaden," he said, "I need you to go testify in your case. Be polite, be professional, and then go directly to urgent care to have your shoulder examined and documented. Don't post anything on social media. Don't talk to the media if they approach you. Don't make any statements to Sheriff's Department personnel. I'll be in Clarkson County." "Tariq, brother, I promise you, go be a witness." What Tariq Lang did became something that lawyers and legal scholars would later reference when writing about the tactical use of civil rights law in situations of institutional misconduct. First, he called a colleague named Serena Hale, a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., who had once clerked for the 11th Circuit and maintained relationships at DOJ that were both meaningful and specific. Tariq briefed her. Serena Hale listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Send me everything you have. I'll make a call to the Southern District office." Then Tariq called a woman named Aria Novak, a professor of constitutional law at Emory University, who also served as an informal advisor to Georgia's State Legislative Judiciary Committee. He briefed her. She said, "I'll reach out to Representative Collins' office. They've been looking for a clean case." Then Tariq pulled up the public records database for the Clarkson County Sheriff's Department and began reading Ronan Blaine's disciplinary file. What he found there was not surprising, but it was thorough. And thorough in cases like this was everything. Between years, Ronan Blaine had accumulated 7 internal affairs complaints. Of those 7, 5 had been filed by black men. Of those 5, 4 had been filed by individuals who had no prior criminal record and were present at the courthouse for civil or administrative matters, not criminal proceedings. Every single complaint had been reviewed, and every single one had been closed with a finding of insufficient evidence to sustain. The 8th complaint would be different, because the 8th complaint would come with footage, a medical report, a witness prepared to testify, and Tariq Lang standing at the table. Tariq arrived in Clarkson County. He went directly to the urgent care clinic where Kaden was being examined, sat in the waiting room, and was there when Kaden walked out with a documented shoulder strain and a referral to an orthopedic specialist for the affected area around the old bullet wound. They sat in the clinic parking lot in Tariq's rental car, and Tariq listened while Kaden told the whole story again. This time with Tariq asking clarifying questions and taking notes in the small, leather-covered notebook he carried everywhere. When it was over, Tariq closed the notebook. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. Kaden looked out the windshield at the parking lot, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon traffic moving up and down the street beyond it. "I want accountability," he said. "Not for me. I want it to mean something." I want the next person, the one who doesn't have a Tariq Lang to call. I want that person to walk into that courthouse and be treated like a human being. Tariq Lang looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once. Then that's what we're going to build, he said. Lila Cross had not been planning to be anyone's hero on a Tuesday morning. She had been at the courthouse to contest a property tax assessment, a discrepancy that had been frustrating her and that she refused on principle to simply pay without fighting. She was the kind of woman who wrote letters, kept records, and had once organized a community campaign to get a broken stoplight fixed on her street. She was small, gray-haired, and possessed of a moral compass that pointed due north with an almost aggressive consistency. When she saw Blaine step into Kaden Voss's path, something in her recognized the moment immediately. She had seen versions of this her entire life. She had raised 3 black sons in Clarkson County and had spent years teaching black children in its public schools. She knew exactly what it looked like when a man in a uniform decided that another man's dignity was negotiable. She pressed record. She did not post the video that night. She held it because something told her to hold it, to make sure it went to the right place rather than simply erupting on social media where it could be dismissed, challenged, and buried under the noise of the internet's infinitely short attention span. She found Kaden's name through a mutual acquaintance, a woman in her church whose son had attended the same veteran support group as Kaden. Lila Cross was sitting in Tariq Lang's temporary office at a hotel conference room in downtown Clarkson, handing over her phone and watching Tariq's face as he viewed the footage. Tariq watched it 3 times without speaking. Then he looked up. "Miss Cross," he said, "are you prepared to give a formal statement?" "I've been prepared since yesterday morning," she said. The footage, combined with the courthouse security recording that Tariq subpoenaed through an emergency motion filed with the Superior Court, was submitted as part of a formal complaint to the Clarkson County Sheriff's Department, the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and the Office of Georgia's Attorney General. Tariq also sent a copy with careful editorial framing to a journalist he trusted, a woman named Rebecca Mercer, who covered law enforcement accountability for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and who had spent the better part of a decade building a reputation for getting stories right before getting them loud. Tariq did not ask for coverage. He simply provided her with verified materials and told her the timeline. Rebecca Mercer watched the footage twice. Then she called her editor. The story went live on a Friday afternoon, which in media terms was not ideal. Friday was where news stories went to die quietly over the weekend. But this one didn't die. It moved. It had been picked up by the Associated Press. It was on cable news. It was everywhere. The footage was damning, not because it was explosive. It was damning because it was boring in the most devastating possible way. There was no screaming, no drawn weapon, no blood, just a methodical, unhurried, almost casual display of contempt. A man in a uniform deciding that the rules applied differently here to this person today, and then the wall, and then Kaden Voss and his socked feet standing still. The comment sections across every platform filled in the usual way, furiously, chaotically, with people who had already decided what they believed before they watched the video. But the video kept spreading, because people who weren't sure what they believed watched it and found themselves becoming sure. Ronan Blaine was placed on administrative leave. He did not see it coming. Or rather, he had told himself he didn't need to. He had made the same calculation that years of unopened consequences had trained him to make, that the machinery of the institution would absorb this the way it had absorbed everything else. A complaint, a review, a finding of insufficient evidence, business as usual. He sat in his living room and watched himself on television. And for the first time in a very long while, Ronan Blaine understood that the machinery had changed. A second piece of information surfaced. This was the twist that reframed everything, not just for the public watching from the outside, but for the people inside the sheriff's department who had been quietly hoping the whole thing would be manageable. It came from an unexpected source, a retired Clarkson County deputy named Harlan Tamblyn, who had served alongside Blaine before retiring. Tamblyn had watched the news coverage over the weekend with growing discomfort, and he called the Clarkson County Sheriff directly, not Tariq Lang, not the media, the sheriff himself, and told him something that the sheriff's phone call log would later show lasted minutes. What Tamblyn reported was this. There had been an incident at the same courthouse involving Blaine and a different black man, a man named Silas Thorne, who was present as a plaintiff in a small claims matter. According to Tamblyn, who had been present that day, Blaine had escalated a routine ID check into a physical confrontation that ended with Thorne being briefly detained and then released without charges. No footage had existed. No formal complaint had been filed because Silas Thorne, an electrician with no savings and 3 kids, had been told quietly by a courthouse administrator that filing a complaint would likely complicate the outcome of his small claims case. Silas Thorne had listened. He had gone home. He had told the story to his wife and to no one else. When Tariq Lang got wind of Tamblyn's call through his contacts at the sheriff's office, because Tariq Lang had contacts everywhere, which was not an accident, but a deliberate and long-cultivated professional reality, he tracked down Silas Thorne. Thorne lived outside Clarkson in a small house with a vegetable garden in the backyard. He was quiet, cautious, and initially unwilling to speak. Then Tariq showed him the footage of Kaden Voss in the courthouse lobby. Silas Thorne watched it without speaking. When it ended, he sat for a long time at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking at nothing in particular. Then he looked up at Tariq Lang. "He did almost exactly the same thing to me," he said. "The wall, the grabbing, the you're free to go at the end like he was doing me a favor. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement?" "I should have done it," Silas Thorne said. "I was scared of what it would cost me. I've spent years thinking about what it cost me not to." He gave the statement. It was detailed, specific, and entirely consistent with the pattern documented in Blaine's disciplinary file. Tariq Lang now had something that transformed the legal landscape of the case completely. He had evidence of a pattern, not an incident, a pattern. And with a pattern, the individual complaint against Blaine expanded into something that implicated not just the officer, but the institution that had reviewed 7 complaints and found insufficient evidence every single time. He filed an amended federal civil rights complaint under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, the statute that allows individuals to sue government officials for civil rights violations, that named not only Ronan Blaine, but the Clarkson County Sheriff's Department as an institution. The sheriff called a press conference to announce that the department was conducting a thorough review of all relevant matters. Tariq Lang watched the press conference from his hotel room and made notes. Brett Blaine sat in a conference room at the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council offices in Atlanta and faced a disciplinary panel. He was represented by the Sheriff's Department union attorney, a man named Harlan Voss, who was experienced and methodical and had successfully defended officers in prior post-hearings. Voss had reviewed the footage multiple times and had built his strategy around a narrow and carefully worded argument. That Blaine had followed department protocol for secondary screening, that the physical contact involved was within department use of force guidelines, and that Kaden Voss had at the moment of contact been non-compliant in a manner that could reasonably be interpreted as a safety concern. It was the kind of argument that sounded reasonable if you hadn't watched the footage. The panel had watched the footage. Tariq Lang sat across the table and let Harlan Voss finish his opening statement without interruption. Then he stood up, buttoned his jacket, and placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of the panel. "Members of the panel," he said, "Mr. Voss has argued that Officer Blaine acted within protocol. I'd like to spend a moment on the word protocol because I think it deserves precision." He paused. "The person Officer Blaine physically assaulted in that lobby, and I use the word assaulted with legal specificity and full intention, holds a top-secret, sensitive, compartmented information security clearance. He is a graduate of BUD/S. He completed 3 combat deployments with SEAL Team 3, including 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Combat Distinguishing Device for an action in Helmand Province that I am not permitted to describe in this setting because the details remain classified." He let that land. "I raise these facts not because they should matter," Tariq Lang continued. "I raise them because they illuminate exactly what protocol looked like in practice." Officer Blaine did not know who Kaden Voss was. He made a decision based on information that had nothing to do with safety or procedure, and the record of his prior conduct, 7 complaints, 5 involving black men in non-criminal courthouse settings, tells us that this was not a mistake or a misjudgment. It was a method. Harlan Voss objected. The panel chair noted the objection and told Tariq Lang to continue. Tariq then called Lila Cross, who gave her account with the clarity and economy of a woman who had spent years teaching facts to children who needed to understand why facts mattered. He introduced the security footage. He introduced Caden's medical report. He introduced Silas Thorne's statement, which was admitted over Voss's objection after a procedural argument. And finally, he called Kaden Voss himself. Kaden testified. He spoke in the same measured, direct way that he always spoke, answering exactly the question asked, no more, no less. When the panel chair asked him how he felt during the physical contact in the lobby, he was quiet for a moment before answering. "I felt what I've been trained to feel in dangerous situations," he said, "which is a very specific kind of alert clarity. You stop feeling and start assessing. I was assessing whether the situation was going to escalate further, how I could de-escalate it, and what documentation would be available afterward." He paused. "I was not afraid of Officer Blaine, but I was afraid of what would happen to me if I responded to his behavior the way it deserved to be responded to." The room was very quiet. "Can you clarify what you mean?" the panel chair asked. "I mean," Kaden said, "that I have been trained to handle threats. I had the physical capacity to remove myself from that situation, but I understood that if I did that, if I exercised any of my training in my own defense, the story would not be about what Officer Blaine did. It would be about what I did, so I stood still. I stood still and I let it happen because I knew that was the only way the truth had any chance of surviving the encounter." He stopped. Then he said, "I've done that calculation in a courthouse. I've also done it on a combat deployment. The fact that I have to do it in both places is something I think about." The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. The post-panel's decision came down. Ronan Blaine's certification as a law enforcement officer in the state of Georgia was revoked. The panel cited the pattern of conduct, the severity of the physical contact, the medical evidence regarding Kaden Voss's injury, and what the decision specifically called a demonstrated and documented pattern of conduct that reflects fundamental unsuitability for the exercise of law enforcement authority. Without post-certification, Blaine could not serve as a law enforcement officer in Georgia. A reciprocity check confirmed that his record would follow him to every state that participated in the National Certification Database, which was increasingly most of them. He was with no college degree, a mortgage, and a career that had just become unavailable to him in most of the country. Voss immediately announced he would appeal. Tariq Lang, when informed of the appeal announcement, replied through his assistant with 2 words. "We know." The civil rights lawsuit filed in federal district court in the Northern District of Georgia was assigned to Judge Robert Hale, a former U.S. attorney with a reputation for impatience with procedural gamesmanship and a deep familiarity with Section 1983 litigation. He scheduled an early case management conference and denied Blaine's motion to dismiss in an opinion that Harlan Voss later described to colleagues in private as the most thorough dismantling I've had in years of practice. The county's liability insurer, reviewing the case file and the footage and the accumulated history of Blaine's disciplinary record, made a calculation that insurers always eventually make. Settlement was cheaper than trial. The Clarkson County Sheriff's Department settled the civil lawsuit for $1.4 million. The settlement required no admission of liability. It never does. But it included 3 mandatory provisions that Tariq Lang had insisted on as non-negotiable. Independent monitoring of the courthouse security operation, mandatory post-approved bias training for all courthouse security personnel, and the creation of a formal process for reviewing and tracking complaints against courthouse security officers that would be audited annually by an outside firm. Tariq Lang had asked for those provisions specifically, not the money, though the money mattered for Kaden and would allow him to retire from the physical demands of his volunteer work and establish the veterans advocacy nonprofit he had been sketching out in notebooks. The structural provisions were what Tariq had organized the entire case around, because structural provisions outlasted settlements. They changed the environment in which the next Kaden Voss, the next Silas Thorne, would encounter the machinery. Kaden was at home when Tariq called him with the settlement terms. He listened to all of it, and when Tariq finished, he asked only one question. "The training and the monitoring, those are real? They have teeth?" "I had Serena's team draft the enforcement mechanism," Tariq said. "They have teeth." "Okay," Kaden said. Then after a moment, "How's Silas?" Silas Thorne, whose account had been essential to establishing the pattern, had received a separate settlement for the incident, significantly smaller, given the absence of direct documentation, but real. More importantly, the formal complaint he had finally filed had been officially sustained, entered into the record, and acknowledged in the county's written response to the settlement terms. Years of silence validated at last. This is the part of the story that resists the clean satisfactions of fiction, because karma in real life is rarely a single dramatic moment. It's a slow reckoning, a progressive narrowing of options, a life restructuring itself around the shape of what a person chose to be. Ronan Blaine appealed the post-decertification through the administrative process and then through the courts. The appeal process took months. At every stage, the footage existed. At every stage, the documented pattern existed. At every stage, his attorneys argued mitigating factors and procedural irregularities and the subjective nature of use of force determinations. And at every stage, the decision was affirmed. During those months, Blaine's marriage, which had been strained for years in ways that had nothing to do with the case, ended. His wife, a dental hygienist named Mira, filed for divorce into the appeal process. She did not cite the case publicly. She cited the marriage privately in a conversation with her sister in terms that suggested the case had simply made visible something that had always been there. Blaine moved into a 2-bedroom apartment and got a job in private security, warehouse monitoring, the kind of work that involved sitting in a small room, watching camera feeds for long stretches. It paid $14 an hour. He had been making $58,000 a year with the department. His name, when searched online, returned the footage, always immediately the footage. He became, in the particular language of the information era, ungoogleable in any useful professional sense. Every employer who ran a background check found a man whose decertification record was public, whose civil settlement was publicly documented, and whose face, that particular expression he wore when he said "or what," had been watched by millions of people. He gave one interview to a local Clarkson radio station in which he maintained that he had been made an example of and that the situation had been completely blown out of proportion by people with an agenda. The interviewer, to their credit, played the audio of Kaden's post-testimony without commentary and asked Blaine to respond. He said the quote had been taken out of context. The interviewer asked what context would change its meaning. Blaine ended the interview. There were people who believed him. There always are. There is an audience for the story in which the man on administrative leave is the real victim. And Blaine found that audience in certain corners of the internet and in some of his former colleagues and in a few men at his gym who shook their heads and said the world had gone soft. He found comfort there, in the solidarity of shared grievance. But comfort of that kind is a ceiling, not a foundation. And Blaine, sitting in his apartment, with his former life arranged in boxes around him, must have understood at some level that the specific kind of authority he had spent years exercising, the authority to make a man stand still while he was violated, the authority to say, or what, was gone. Not just legally, gone from the world in a way that would not reverse. The man he had shoved into a wall had used one phone call and months to build something that would outlast both of them. The Voss-Thorne Veterans and Community Justice Initiative, named jointly for Kaden and Silas at Kaden's insistence, held its opening event in Clarkson County on a Saturday morning. The initiative had 3 pillars: legal support and referrals for veterans and community members who experience civil rights violations, know your rights training delivered in partnership with local churches, schools, and community centers, and a structured fellowship program for young men from underserved backgrounds who were interested in law, public policy, or military service. Tariq Lang sat on the board. Aria Novak from Emory delivered a keynote address about the constitutional foundations of what they were doing. Rebecca Mercer covered the event for the AJC. Lila Cross sat in the front row in a yellow dress and cried briefly and quietly when Kaden, speaking from a podium in a community center gymnasium, mentioned her name. Silas Thorne stood at the back of the room with his wife and watched the whole thing with the expression of a man who had waited years to exhale and was only now beginning to. Kaden's speech was not long. He was not by nature a man who mistook length for significance. He talked about the lobby briefly, without drama. He talked about what it felt like to make the calculation to stand still, to choose the truth surviving over the ego surviving. He talked about Tariq Lang picking up on the 3rd ring. He talked about Lila Cross's steady hands. Then he said something that would be quoted in Rebecca Mercer's article and shared widely enough to find its way into a law school professor's lecture materials at Emory and at Georgetown. The system, he said, is not a wall. It's a door. It's a door that has been locked from the inside for a very long time by people who benefit from it staying locked. What we found, what every case like this finds, is that locks can be picked, but you need the right tools, and you need someone who knows how to use them, and you need the patience to work quietly while the people on the other side of the door are waiting for you to go away. He paused. We are not going away. The room applauded. Silas Thorne at the back put his hands together slowly, looking at the floor, and then looked up. Kaden's nonprofit received its first major grant. $380,000 from a foundation that specialized in veterans' legal advocacy, secured with the help of Serena Hale's network in Washington. A second grant followed from a Georgia-based philanthropy organization whose director had seen the story and watched the footage and made a decision about where to put her resources. Within its first operating year, The initiative had assisted 47 individuals with formal complaint processes, provided Know Your Rights training to over 800 people across 6 counties, and accepted its first cohort of 6 fellows, young men, 3 of whom were veterans, 3 of whom were recent high school graduates from families that had never had a lawyer to call. Kaden hired a full-time staff member to manage operations. He hired a part-time legal coordinator from Tariq Lang's network. He kept volunteering at the Veterans Outreach Center on Tuesdays because some commitments outlast the circumstances that made them. He did not give many interviews. When he did, he was precise, measured, and entirely uninterested in centering himself in the narrative he was telling. Reporters who came looking for the dramatic hero of an inspiring underdog story went away with something less tidy and more real. A man who was angry in a functional way, who had converted anger into architecture, and who was more interested in the structure he was building than in the story of why he built it. He kept the document from the post-hearing, the formal decision revoking Blaine's certification, in a file on his laptop, not on the wall, not framed, in a file. He had looked at it once since receiving it, then closed it and moved on to the next item on his task list. The next item was always the work. So, the Clarkson County case became, in the specific and unglamorous way that real change usually becomes, a reference point, not a revolution, not a watershed moment that swept everything before it away and replaced it with something clean and new, but a reference point, a documented, verified, judicially acknowledged instance of a pattern being named, pursued, and dismantled, which then sat in databases and legal filings and academic papers and training curricula and is evidence that the thing could be done. Post councils in 3 other states cited the Clarkson decision in their own disciplinary proceedings within the year following. 2 of those proceedings resulted in decertifications. 1 resulted in a consent decree governing use of force protocols in a county courthouse system. Silas Thorne's electricians' union, learning of his case through the coverage, invited him to speak at their annual meeting about workplace rights and the importance of formal documentation. He spoke mostly about the cost of silence. He was not an eloquent speaker. He was something better. A specific man describing a specific experience with enough plainness and precision that the people listening could see exactly where they stood in relation to it. Harlan Tamblin, the retired deputy who had called the sheriff, was asked by a journalist whether he regretted not speaking up when he witnessed the incident with Silas Thorne. He thought about it for a long moment and said, "Every day. But then I think about whether regret is useful, and mostly it isn't. What's useful is that I talked when it still mattered. I talked when there was still time to add something. I got that right. I got it right eventually. It took too long, but I got it right." Lila Cross continued contesting her property tax assessment. She won finally, the discrepancy resolved in her favor, following a formal, administrative review. She framed the resolution letter and hung it on her kitchen wall next to a photo of her 3 sons. "I was there that morning for the discrepancy," she told Rebecca Mercer in a follow-up piece. "I ended up being somewhere else entirely. I've made my peace with that. The man deserved to have someone's hands be steady. I just happened to be the person whose hands were steady that day." She accepted a position on the advisory board of the Voss-Thorne Initiative. She attended every quarterly meeting, always early, always with notes. Tariq Lang added the case to the materials he used when mentoring young civil rights attorneys. He added it not to the section on victories, but to the section on the importance of the first hours, the narrow, crucial window in which evidence is preserved or lost. Witnesses are found or dispersed, and the narrative either gets anchored in verifiable fact or gets swallowed by the institution's instinct for self-protection. The call Kaden made from outside courtroom 7, Tariq told a group of law students at Emory, was not a call asking for help. It was a call delivering information to someone who knew what to do with it. The difference matters. Help is passive. It puts the power in the hands of the person being called. Information is active. It gives both people on the call something to work with. Kaden didn't call me and say, "Something terrible happened and I don't know what to do." He called me and said, "Here is exactly what happened in sequence, and here are the variables I've already assessed." That gave us a head start on an institution that was already moving to protect itself. He paused. "That head start," he said, "was everything. This is a story about a man who was wronged. But it is not primarily a story about being wronged. Being wronged is the beginning, the ignition point, the first domino. The story lives in what came after, in the series of choices and relationships and quiet, unglamorous acts of preparation that transformed a lobby incident into a structural intervention. Kaden Voss had Tariq Lang's number in his phone because he had been the kind of person who maintained relationships with care and intention. He had Tariq's number because years ago on a base in Virginia, two men had found in each other a quality of honesty that both recognized as rare and worth preserving. The phone call worked because the relationship existed. The relationship existed because Kaden had built it. Lila Cross had steady hands because she was the kind of person whose hands were steady, not from training, but from character. From years of deciding that the truth was worth the effort of documenting it, even when documentation was inconvenient, even when the moment was uncomfortable, even when it would have been easier to look at the floor and wait for the thing to be over. Silas Thorne's testimony mattered because Harlan Tamblyn found his conscience and made a phone call. Tamblyn found his conscience because years of watching the footage playing on his television had finally become heavier than the comfort of staying quiet. These are not dramatic elements. They are accumulated ordinary human decisions: to keep a number, to press record, to speak at last, to call before it was too late. The drama that resulted from those decisions was real and consequential. But the decisions themselves were quiet, private, made in ordinary moments without any guarantee of outcome. That is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the retelling, because it is the part that is hardest to make into compelling television. The footage is compelling. The hearing is compelling. The settlement figure is compelling. But the real structure of what happened was built in the parking lot of an urgent care clinic and on the phone and in a kitchen with a coffee mug and in years of a teacher's daily decision to keep her eyes open. The machinery of injustice depends above almost everything else on the isolation of its targets, on the person wronged having no number to call, no witness with steady hands, no former colleague who finally breaks his silence, no attorney who drives hours on the same afternoon, because a friendship forged years ago is not the kind of thing you abandon. What Kaden Voss had in the end was not luck. He had the architecture of relationships built over time with intention. That meant he was never actually alone in that lobby, even when it looked like he was. That is the lesson that makes this story worth telling. Not that a black Navy SEAL was treated with contempt by a man who didn't bother to learn who he was. That happens every day to people with fewer resources and less remarkable records. And most of those stories do not end with a federal settlement and a non-profit and a law school lecture. The lesson is that the path from the lobby to the outcome ran entirely through other people, through trust built slowly, through community maintained carefully, through the decision made again and again in small, unmemorable moments to remain connected to other human beings who were committed to the same truths. That is not a comfort. It is a challenge. It asks something of everyone in the story and something of everyone hearing it. It asks whose number is in your phone. It asks when the moment comes, will your hands be steady? It asks, how long have you been waiting to speak, and what is it costing you to stay silent? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that Kaden Voss, Silas Thorne, Lila Cross, and Harlan Tamblin all answered on different mornings, in different ways, at different costs. And the aggregate of those answers is the story you just heard. What happened in that courthouse lobby in Clarkson County was not unique. It happens every day in every state to people whose names we will never know, because they had no one to call, because no one was filming, because the machinery moved faster than the truth could keep up with. What made this story different was not the footage. It was the relationships, the preparation, the refusal to stand isolated in the face of something designed to isolate. Kaden Voss survived 3 combat deployments. He survived a bullet. He survived a courthouse wall. And then, most importantly, he turned the experience into something that would outlast the experience itself. That is what accountability looks like when it actually works, not revenge architecture. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about whose number is in your phone, about whose calls you would film, about what silence has been costing someone near you, then share it. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear it. The algorithm doesn't care about justice, it cares about engagement. Every like, every comment, every share is a vote for this kind of story reaching one more person. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you'll never miss a story like this one, because the next person in that lobby deserves to know that somewhere someone was paying attention.